In November of 2023, 20-year-old Daja Holly was hauled away in handcuffs from the Walmart that she worked at after becoming violent with local police, accused of stealing cash from her register. The store's loss prevention team had reportedly seen her stealing cash at least 5 separate times, with the calculated total exceeding $500. On the day of her arrest, Holly initially complied and followed police officers to the loss prevention office when asked to do so, but quickly became belligerent, then violent when police attempted to arrest her there. Holly reportedly tried to punch and kick the arresting officers in the store's back office. The officers eventually restrained her and took her into custody. She was charged with theft of over $500, aggravated assault to a peace officer, and resisting arrest. She was eventually released and served a notice to appear in court to answer for her charges. The case is seemingly ongoing, with no update just yet as to Holly's ultimate fate. Number 8. Nikki Frenchco. In July of 2022, 49-year-old Nikki Frenchco, one of 3 county commissioners of Trumbull County, Ohio, was arrested in the middle of a public forum meeting when she allegedly became disruptive. In the time leading up to her arrest, Frenchco, the only Republican on the board, had already clashed with her 2 Democratic counterparts on countless occasions. During the public meeting in July of 2022, the tensions that have been building up between Frenchco and the other 2 board members, namely Mauro Cantalamessa and Frank Fudder, finally came to an explosive climax. A month before the July meeting, Frenchco had read a letter into the record in which the mother of an inmate claimed that her son had received inadequate medical attention after he contracted meningitis. The sheriff took offense to this letter being read in public and demanded an apology from Frenchco in a letter of his own, stating that the claims in her letter were unsubstantiated. During the July meeting, Frank Fudder, one of the other 2 commissioners on the board, ordered a clerk to read the sheriff's letter, to which Frenchco objected. As the clerk was reading the sheriff's letter, Frenchco continued interrupting her and even started mocking the clerk, allegedly. After the clerk was done reading out the letter, she burst out into tears. Frenchco took this opportunity to start discussing the sheriff's letter before being interrupted by the 3rd board member, who told her, "You are talking about the chief law enforcement officer in Trumbull County. It's unacceptable." Fudder then chimed in and told Frenchco to apologize to the sheriff and to stop talking, neither of which she did. 2 deputies present at the meeting then directed her to leave the room before arresting her just outside of it. Events that were all captured on and broadcasted from Frenchco's cell phone. Frenchco was officially charged under a law regarding offending group sensibilities in a public meeting, as well as disrupting a lawful meeting, a 4th-degree misdemeanor. Investigation later revealed that the arrest was not only unnecessary because the meeting could have simply been adjourned, among other methods, but that it was also coordinated. The sheriff had reportedly sent text messages to a reporter just minutes before the arrest, which was the most compelling evidence. The federal judge presiding over the case ruled that Frenchco's rights had been violated. Judge Calabrese said in his ruling that, without question, Miss Frenchco was removed from the meeting because she communicated a message disfavored by those in power, further adding that the 2 other commissioners, Sheriff Paul Monroe and the 2 sheriff's deputies, Sergeant Harold Wicks and Sergeant Robert Ross, were personally liable for damages, which will be determined at a later hearing. Number 7. He couldn't have it his way. On February the 16th of 2023, 33-year-old Eddie Lewis Smith of Gulfport, Mississippi, was arrested after walking out from behind the drive-through counter at Burger King and shooting a customer. The pair had reportedly gotten into an argument while the customer was ordering when Smith decided to exit the booth and walk up to the car, to which the customer quickly reacted by exiting the vehicle. Words and fists flew first, before they were followed by bullets. Police were actually attending to another issue nearby when a citizen informed an officer about a fight taking place at the local Burger King. When police found the two, the cashier was on top of the man. This was no ordinary game of fast food fisticuffs. Smith had pulled a gun and fired twice. One of those shots hit the customer, and the other hit Smith in his own hand. He was arrested, and both men were transported for medical treatment. It later came to light that Smith was already a convicted felon, and he was held on $300,000 bond. Number 6. Brothers for life sentences. In October of 2021, 19-year-old Ridwan Farouk was arrested at his workplace, a JD Sports location in Selly Oak, England. Him and his 21-year-old brother Mohammed were suspected of attacking and murdering someone the night before. The attack on 20-year-old Amin Talia took place on the night of October 1st, right in front of his house when he exited it. Mohammed had been beefing with the victim for a while, and on that fatal night, he and his younger brother were lying in wait and swooped in with knives. When they saw the victim, they chased Talia and inflicted 2 grievous wounds, then left him bleeding out. The wounded man sought help, but by the time emergency workers arrived, he was beyond saving. The next morning, while on the drive to work, Ridwan asked his co-worker to drive by the crime scene and expressed dismay when he learned somebody had died, saying he was certainly going down for this and that it was his brother's beef, not his. As a result of this supposed admission, his co-worker contacted the authorities shortly after. Police arrived at the JD Sports branch and arrested Ridwan. The 2 young killers were brought to Birmingham Crown Court. The judge there brought up findings from the investigation, including that Ridwan had attempted and failed to secure a gun. Heart-wrenching words of grief from the victim's mother did not help the pair's case. It was noted that the brothers may not have intended to kill their victim, but the planned-out nature of the attack and its ultimate outcome were all that mattered in sentencing. The 2 were given life sentences, with 24 years to serve at minimum before they could be considered for parole. Number 5. Rex Howerman. In July of 2023, 59-year-old Rex Howerman was arrested outside of the Manhattan office he worked in, as police saw safety concerns in approaching him at home, where he was suspected to be storing a high number of weapons. Officers watched his routine and waited to arrest him away from his cache of arms, over half of which were unregistered. He was wanted in connection with at least 3 murders and potentially more, tied to the infamous Gilgo Beach case. The Gilgo Beach murders are a series of unsolved killings stemming all the way back to 1996, in which no less than 11 individuals were slain. The murders sparked a slow burn media firestorm as investigators scrambled to gather and process evidence. Technological and investigative breakthroughs over the years enabled them to finally tie Howerman to the crime spree. Thus far, officials have only been able to pin 3 of the murders on him, with a 4th bearing loose ties that may allow them to charge him in the near future. At the time of his arrest, Howerman was living in Long Island with his wife and 2 adult children. The investigation is ongoing, with his now estranged wife initially maintaining that the man she married is not capable of murder. She and the 2 children expressed outrage and disgust, but have come to terms with the fact that there are concrete ties between Howerman and at least 2 of the murders. Despite having already pinned 3 murders on the suspect, investigators are playing the long game and have begun digging up every unsolved murder and missing persons case in the area since 1996 to see if there are any ties to Howerman. Number 4. falsely arrested photographer. On July the 5th of 2018, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist out of Denver, Colorado, by the name of Susan Green, was arrested for recording police activity. She found officers taking in a naked man on a public street and began recording with her smartphone. Green, who works for the Denver Post, was confronted by two of the officers on the scene. The two officers, Adam Paulson and James Brooks, ultimately let Green go, but not before they forcefully cuffed her. In the process, they reportedly told Green to act like a lady, and when she said they were hurting her, she was told that she was hurting herself by resisting. Green, being a journalist and thus a strong proponent of the United States First Constitutional Amendment and its right to free speech and freedom of the press, filed a lawsuit against the city. An internal investigation confirmed her report, and the officers were docked 2 days' pay. In September of 2019, the city cut Green a check for $50,000 to settle the matter. A spokesperson for the authorities reported that First Amendment training is part and parcel of the standard training package for officers. Green, meanwhile, maintained that if she had not fought back, she would be feeding into a precedent of repeated violations that would eventually render the law meaningless. Number 3. The Mouthy Menace. In November of 2023, Walmart worker Adrienne Edwards out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, left work in handcuffs after she threatened to shoot a co-worker during an argument. The accused was found outside the store by police sitting in her car with a loaded pistol in hand. Police proceeded to interview the suspect when they arrived just before 8 a.m. in the morning, and she rather swiftly admitted to the threats. Edwards was immediately booked on a charge of threatening a violent act. Multiple witnesses were talked to by police who all corroborated the accusations. Edwards herself, when pressed, said that her motivation boiled down to a supervisor calling her mouthy during a shift. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and maybe it will be your video that we'll be doing next. Number 2. Tipsy teacher in Tecumseh. In September of 2023, Jennifer Davis, a teacher at Cross Timbers Elementary School in Tecumseh, Oklahoma, was arrested at work for public intoxication. School staff reportedly noticed that she seemed out of sorts and quite possibly drunk, and decided to contact authorities. They quickly got her away from the students, notified parents, and brought local police in. Officers arrived and questioned Davis, who claimed that she had enjoyed a glass of wine the night before and no alcohol since, before failing several field sobriety tests. Since there are many factors that could go into somebody failing field sobriety tests, officers decided to give her a breathalyzer test just to be sure that alcohol was actually the culprit. True to their suspicions, the tipsy teacher blew a .066, which is below the legal limit for driving under the influence, but more than enough to discount the educator's claim that her last time imbibing alcohol had been the night before. Because of her apparent impairment in a public setting, particularly in her capacity as a teacher for young students, Davis was booked despite her relatively low blood alcohol level. In the wake of the incident, Davis has parted ways with the school, with a substitute teacher filling in until a more permanent replacement can be found. For the school's part, leadership put a message out to parents stating that no students witnessed the arrest and no staff will be revealing to students what happened to Miss Davis. Right after number 1, we'll be adding our compilation about when everything goes wrong at work. Stick around if you'd like to binge that. Number 1. John Evans. On August the 19th of 2022, 43-year-old John Evans of Bealton, Virginia, was arrested after a dispute with a co-worker literally went ballistic. The details are unclear, but Evans got into some sort of disagreement with the co-worker at Richmond Traffic Control, where they were employed. Things escalated to the point that John went out to his truck, seemingly ready to bail without taking the argument any further. Instead, he punctuated his point by taking a 9mm pistol out of his truck and firing a shot into the ground right next to his co-worker's vehicle tire before driving away. The irate man didn't go far. He drove to the nearby Ramoth Baptist Church. Local deputies found him sitting in his car there, and he was arrested without much fuss. They also recovered his gun. He was charged with reckless handling of a firearm, carrying a concealed weapon, and shooting in a public place. Number 8. Incidents in Antarctica. For 6 months leading up to October of 2018, Sergei Savitsky and Oleg Beloguzov, both in their 50s, had been working together at the Bellingshausen station on King George Island, off the coast of Antarctica. Savitsky worked as an electrical engineer, while Beloguzov was a welder at the research station. Tensions between the two men grew, with one reported reason being that Beloguzov was constantly spoiling the endings of books that Savitsky was checking out of the station library. The dispute reached a boiling point on October the 9th, when an intoxicated Savitsky stabbed his co-worker multiple times in the chest. The violent reaction was also described as stemming from an emotional breakdown, presumably caused by being confined to a small space for a prolonged period of time. Beloguzov was airlifted to a hospital in Chile and eventually recovered, while Savitsky surrendered to the station manager. At the legal proceedings in Russia, Beloguzov was ultimately forgiven of Savitsky after he'd expressed remorse and ultimately proposed the case to be dropped, which it was. While the most recent, it was one of only a handful of criminal incidents to have occurred in Antarctica. The first reported one dates back to 1959 at the Vostok station in Princess Elizabeth Land. Two researchers were playing a game of chess when one of them, enraged that he'd lost, attacked the other with an ice axe. It's unclear if the victim recovered or not, but following a KGB investigation, chess was banned across all stations by the Antarctic Soviet. Number 7. Kenneth Saal. On June the 10th of 2019, Carolyn Byington was found dead at her apartment in Plainsboro, New Jersey. The alarm was raised by co-workers at a Princeton marketing firm after 26-year-old Byington had failed to return from her lunch break. Byington had been brutally stabbed to death, but at first, the authorities had no lead on a suspect. Coinciding with the woman's lunch break was that of her co-worker, 30-year-old Kenneth Saal, who told his supervisor he'd be late because he needed to get his car repaired. His demeanor after returning from the break and in the days that followed began to change. A number of co-workers noticed cuts on his hands and knuckles, while his story about getting his car fixed was revealed to have been a lie. He'd even reportedly asked the co-worker if he could get arrested on circumstantial evidence alone. Both Saal and Byington had been hired at the firm in 2016, and it's believed at some point he'd developed an obsession for her. Neighbors reported seeing Saal at the apartment complex in the weeks leading up to her death. Google location services also placed him at the scene. Saal was connected to the slaying after DNA material recovered from under the victim's fingernails couldn't conclusively exclude him. It's believed that he'd been waiting for Byington at her apartment and that he ambushed her when she entered. Neighbors reported hearing faint screams and the sound of furniture being moved around, but hadn't realized an attack was occurring. Saal, a father of one, was charged with first-degree murder and possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose, but he denied killing Byington. According to subsequent updates on the case, the lunch break killer was offered a plea deal of 30 years. Number 6. Accident at Chinese factory. In February of 2019, security footage from a factory in Yidu in the Chinese province of Hebei started circulating online and showed a horrific workplace accident. An unnamed forewoman was directing a truck when she was suddenly scooped from behind by a loader. The driver was reportedly distracted by his cell phone and hadn't seen her. With the woman still trapped inside, he plunged the bucket into a pile of sand. He then turned the loader to deposit the material into a compactor. The vibrating machinery was used to crush stones and sandy soil into uniform particles. Shortly after releasing the bucket into the compactor, the driver saw his co-worker's body flailing at the top. He raised the alarm and others rushed in to save her. but it was too late. She was later pronounced dead, with asphyxiation identified as the main cause. Number 5. Lee Rodart Jr. In August of 2017, Savannah Gold arrived at her workplace, the Bonefish Grill, in Jacksonville, Florida, but never made it into the building. The 21-year-old's car was found unlocked in the parking lot. Her purse was in the front seat, while the vehicle's tires were slashed. Gold was in an on-again, off-again relationship with co-worker and culinary manager Lee Rodart Jr., age 30. Surveillance footage would show her arriving in the parking lot at 5:35 p.m. She then got into Rodart's vehicle on the passenger side, and about a quarter of an hour later, what appeared to be a struggle ensued. Rodart then briefly walked over to Gold's vehicle before driving off with her still in his car. Within a few hours, Gold's friends and family started receiving messages that she'd met a really great guy and that they were running away together. Her family instantly became suspicious, as the messages weren't written in a tone matching Gold's, and the spelling was, as her brother put it, all whacked out. Following her disappearance, Rodart assisted her relatives with the search and even handed out missing person flyers. Upon being questioned by the police, however, his story crumbled, and he confessed to killing Gold in his car and then disposing of her body in a nearby lake. Divers later recovered her remains. The motive remains a mystery, although Rodart claimed self-defense and that Gold had attacked him first. He ultimately pled guilty to second-degree murder in 2021 and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Number 4. Murder of Kiona Lynette Davis. In February of 2018, a Pennsylvania woman was shot and killed during a robbery that had been orchestrated by her co-worker. 27-year-old Kiona Lynette Davis had told others at the Wilkinsburg dollar store where she worked about a $7,000 tax refund that she was expecting. Hearing about the mother of two's good fortune, co-worker Leah Alana Whitley, age 21, contrived a plan to steal her money. To that end, she sought the help of accomplices Dane James Taylor and Kajin Xavier Scott, both in their early 20s. During Davis's lunch break, her grandmother brought her $3,000 in cash. Whitley saw the exchange and set the plan in motion by texting Taylor. He got a ride from Scott, and shortly after 2:30, the two followed Davis in a Toyota Corolla as she was walking on the street. They pulled up in front of her, and a masked Taylor got out, threatened Davis with a handgun, and demanded the money. She begged him to stop, claiming she didn't have it. Taylor fired 2 shots at Davis, and while the first one missed, the second one went through her hip. She would later succumb to the gunshot injury at a local hospital. Investigators used surveillance footage and eyewitness testimonies to trace the Corolla back to Scott, who subsequently confessed to the entire plot. Scott's sentence remained to be determined. Whitley and Taylor both accepted plea deals and were given sentences of 20 to 50 and 30 to 60 years in prison, respectively. Number 3. Tangela Parker. In July of 2021, following a 6-month manhunt, a woman and her husband were arrested in Arizona for a fatal shooting at a furniture plant in North Carolina. The incident had occurred in January after Felicia Marlowe and co-worker Tangela Parker, both in their early 50s, got into an argument about moving tables in the work area. The former's husband told a media outlet that she'd been bullied by Parker. Other workers at the plant claimed the woman had a reputation for being aggressive and argumentative. Marlowe filed a complaint, and in the dispute's aftermath, Parker was suspended for 3 days. She returned to the plant on the afternoon of January the 13th and opened fire on Marlowe. The authorities were called to the scene and the plant went on lockdown. The victim was taken to a local hospital where she was later pronounced dead from multiple gunshot injuries. Parker and her husband, 62-year-old Eric, then went on the run. They ultimately settled in Phoenix, where for several months they lived out of their Honda CR-V after having changed its license plates. They survived by begging for money and panhandling before finding a job at a horse ranch. After an investigation spanning 8 states and combing through dozens of leads, the couple was found and arrested. Parker was charged with first-degree murder, and her husband was charged as an accessory after the fact. Number 2. Christopher Dillard. On April the 19th of 2017, in the early hours of the morning, the body of 24-year-old Nicole Gland was found behind the upper deck lounge in Chesterton, Illinois, where she worked as a bartender. She'd bled out in her SUV. after sustaining over 20 stab wounds. The culprit was later identified as 51-year-old Christopher Dillard, a bouncer at the bar. When first questioned, he confessed to officers that he'd killed Gland after she'd refused his advances, also mentioning that he'd been doing drugs for days. However, those statements were thrown out when Dillard's defense argued that the officers had violated his constitutional rights by continuing to question him even after he'd requested an attorney. However, in a jailhouse phone call to his longtime girlfriend, he seemed eager to confess and told her that it was the drugs, while in another conversation, Dillard said that he'd messed up bad. A judge considered the phone calls admissible as Dillard had been informed they were being recorded. While he didn't outright confess to the killing, the conversations weighed heavily in front of a jury. Dillard was found guilty and sentenced to 65 years in prison. Number 1. Klaus O. In 2018, at a metal fittings company in Schlossholt-Stuttenbruck, Germany, an unnamed worker took out his sandwich during the lunch break and found that it had a white powder on it. He became suspicious when, the following day, the same substance appeared on another sandwich. The worker took the matter up with the company's management, and a hidden camera was installed in the break room. It would later capture a worker, identified only as Klaus O, in accordance to German privacy laws, as he took food and drinks out of his colleagues' bags, then covered them with dust before meticulously placing them back. Tests would later reveal the substance to have been acetate, which is almost tasteless and can severely impact organ health. 57-year-old machinist Klaus had been working at the company for over 30 years and had always kept to himself. When the police searched his home, they found a makeshift laboratory where he'd been experimenting with a number of heavy metals, including cadmium, lead, and mercury. Ultimately, 2 colleagues had suffered severe kidney problems, and one has sustained brain damage that left him in a vegetative state, unlikely to recover. However, those incidents were recorded only since Klaus had been discovered. The police launched an investigation into 21 deaths of former employees at the company, of which Klaus may have been responsible. He kept quiet throughout most of his trial and never commented on his motives. A psychologist who'd spoken to him claimed that Klaus approached the matter like a researcher, interested in observing how his colleagues would be affected by the toxins. The psychologist was quoted as saying that Klaus seemed like a scientist who was testing substances on a guinea pig. He was charged with attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison. The sentence was uncharacteristically harsh for the German legal system, but Klaus was identified as a danger to society. Number 9. Jordan Carpenter. On October the 24th of 2022, Jordan Carpenter shot his 28-year-old co-worker Nicole Hammond after being rejected by her on multiple occasions. Carpenter, who was 36 at the time, worked alongside Hammond at Dubois Textile Inc., a store located in St. Cloud, Minnesota. He'd constantly flirted with and touched the victim inappropriately during shifts they worked together. On the night before the murder, Hammond had texted Carpenter asking him to stop his unwanted advances toward her and indicated that she didn't feel comfortable working with him. The man had a reported history of harassment and was described as having a bad temper by fellow co-workers. Allegedly furious about Hammond's text message, Carpenter confronted her in the store's parking lot the following day and fatally shot her in the neck. When police arrived at the scene, they came upon Hammond lying lifelessly on the ground near her car in a pool of blood. Attempts to revive her proved fruitless, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. Carpenter fled the scene, but officers were able to apprehend him, still carrying the murder weapon 3 hours later. He denied having shot Hammond and explained that although he was at the scene, he hadn't called 911 or helped his co-worker because he was in shock. As of the latest available updates on the matter, Minnesota authorities' homicide investigation was still ongoing, but if found guilty, Carpenter faced a possible sentence of 40 years behind bars. Number 8. Joshua Johnson. On June the 11th of 2022, Joshua Johnson murdered his co-worker Riley Whitelaw at the Colorado Walgreens where they worked. 28-year-old Johnson had been harassing the young woman for over a year before the incident, in which he violently attacked her in the break room. Although she'd told management about Johnson's mistreatment of her back in 2021, there were reportedly no measures taken to ensure her safety. Police were called to the scene of the assault after a customer reported hearing someone scream in the back, where Whitelaw's body was subsequently found. Johnson had put papers over the break room's windows to ensure no one would notice his victim's body while he fled the scene. He'd also attempted to conceal his actions from the store's security cameras by stocking boxes in front of them. The suspect, who was left with numerous bruises and cuts following the altercation with Whitelaw, was ultimately apprehended about 100 miles outside Colorado Springs. During questioning, he refused to accept responsibility for the murder and denied having covered the surveillance cameras even when presented with footage of the minutes leading up to the attack. As of the latest developments, the case was still ongoing. Number 7. Maya Marcano. Sometime between September the 24th and the 27th of 2021, Florida teen Maya Marcano was murdered by maintenance worker Armando Caballero in Orlando. Her body, which wasn't discovered until October the 2nd, was so severely skeletonized that medical examiners were unable to determine the 19-year-old's exact cause of death. The black tape wrapped around her ankles and wrists as well as over her mouth and nose indicated Marcano had been tortured during her final moments. She was positively identified by way of dental records, as well as the belongings found near her remains. 27-year-old Caballero, who at the time had an active arrest warrant for breaking into Marcano's apartment, was described as having allegedly been fixated on the victim. Detectives immediately identified him as a suspect and was the only person of interest during the entire course of the homicide investigation. 5 days before the discovery of Marcano's skeletal remains in the woods behind her apartment complex, Caballero was found dead by the police. Marcano's family created a foundation in her honor to help educate the general public about and provide resources to families of missing persons. Number 6. Catherine Pimentel. After spending 7 years on the run to avoid prosecution for assaulting a co-worker with a broken bottle and attacking the police officers that responded to the scene, New Hampshire resident Catherine Pimentel was finally apprehended and deported back to the US in June of 2016. Pimentel had fled the country after repeatedly stabbing a fellow exotic dancer in the bathroom of the club where she worked on July the 27th of 2007. She was also accused of driving while intoxicated to escape the scene and assaulting an officer of the law to evade capture. Pimentel absconded to the Dominican Republic, where she was ultimately located by FBI officials 9 years after the initial incident. She was charged with mayhem, assault and battery, assaulting a police officer, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct, as well as drunk driving and bail jumping. Although the unnamed victim wasn't present during the 2016 court hearing, sources confirmed her mother's attendance. The latter reportedly appeared pleased that her daughter's attacker was finally being brought to justice. Number 5. Sharonda James. Alabama resident Sharonda James was finally arrested after being on the run from the authorities for over a month in early 2019. The 30-year-old had been accused of murdering her Piggly Wiggly co-worker, Jerica Manuel, on Christmas Eve of the previous year. Manuel, aged 28, was working her shift at the grocery store when she got into a heated argument with James. Although the subject of the pair's quarrel wasn't specified in subsequent reports, James, who already had an extensive criminal history, eventually pulled out a firearm and gunned Manuel down. 5 months earlier, James had faced legal consequences after being accused of assaulting a woman following a traffic accident. In the Piggly Wiggly shooting aftermath, she fled the state, ultimately ending up in Tennessee before being arrested by local police, who'd been alerted to her whereabouts. On September the 19th of 2022, James pleaded guilty to manslaughter to avoid prosecution on the more serious charge of murder. Presiding Judge Alaric May accepted the plea bargain, sentencing James to 20 years in prison. Number 4. Carly Abshire. 22-year-old Carly Abshire, a Dutch woman residing in Beaumont, Texas, was accused of drunkenly causing a car accident that led to the death of Madison Hope Thibodeau on August the 7th of 2022. Abshir was giving 23-year-old Thibodeau, her co-worker, a ride home after the conclusion of their shift at the Modelo's sports bar on the night in question. The young woman had been drinking heavily before getting behind the wheel and eventually lost control of the vehicle as she attempted to merge onto the highway. The car flipped multiple times before landing upside down and catching fire. Although Abshir was able to flee from the flaming wreckage in time, the same could not be said for Thibodeau. First responders rushed the surviving motorist to the hospital, where she admitted to drinking at the bar during her shift. Her blood alcohol content was a reported 0.097, rendering her legally impaired and therefore forbidden from operating any kind of vehicle. If found guilty of manslaughter, she could face up to 20 years behind bars as punishment. Number 3. Reynaldo Rivera Ortiz Jr. 59-year-old anesthesiologist Reynaldo Rivera Ortiz Jr. was arrested for meddling with IV bags at the hospital in Dallas, Texas, where he worked, contributing to the death of a fellow doctor on June the 22nd of 2022. The 55-year-old victim was identified only by the initials MK in court documents. MK had reportedly used one of the contaminated IV bags to treat herself for dehydration, unaware that Rivera Ortiz had injected bupivacaine, a nerve-blocking agent, into the saline solution. Hospital authorities believed that Rivera Ortiz may have also been responsible for several other cardiac emergencies, which took place during the 2 months after the doctor's death. Most of the incidents occurred when patients required more than a single IV bag. Rivera Ortiz was arrested and charged with tampering with a consumer product, as well as intentionally adulterating drugs, and consequently faced the possibility of spending the remainder of his life in prison. Number 2. Ebony Angel Jordan and Bianca Alexandria Strayhorn. On December the 1st of 2016, exotic dancers Ebony Angel Jordan and Bianca Alexandria Strayhorn were arrested after starting a brawl at a restaurant in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and subsequently attempting to flee the police. Jordan, aged 23, and Strayhorn, aged 26, reportedly shoved 2 fellow dancers whom they'd been arguing with, and when they were asked to leave, the violence escalated. The 2 suspects allegedly remarked that if they were going to be kicked out, they might as well make it worth it, and proceeded to hit one of the women with a stiletto shoe just below the eye, spray mace at them, and pull the other victim's hair with enough force to rip out part of her weave. When police arrived at the scene, Jordan and Strayhorn fruitlessly attempted to get into their car and make an escape. While being taken into custody, they vehemently insisted that they'd been acting in self-defense during the altercation. Number 1. Le Hatu. On August the 2nd of 2017, Le Hatu, a meat plant worker from Kane County, Illinois, accidentally killed co-worker I. Mousse while recklessly playing with a knife during a shift. According to 27-year-old Hatu's confession, he'd been working with Mousse on the day in question when the man threw a piece of meat at him. Hatu jokingly flicked the knife he was using at his station toward 22-year-old Mousse, but it inadvertently slipped from his grip. The blade ended up impaling Mousse's chest near his heart. Although Hatu attempted to render aid to his co-worker, the injury proved too severe. Mousse was pronounced dead at the scene. Hatu was consequently arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter with his bail set at $10,000. He spent the duration of the legal proceedings out on bond, forbidden from going anywhere near his previous place of employment. In 2019, Hatu pleaded guilty to his charges as part of an agreement with prosecutors, and he was later sentenced to 2.5 years behind bars. In February of 2023, Dan Foster and Jaron Williams, aged 49 and 27, were in the cafeteria at an Intel semiconductor facility in Chandler, Arizona. After the night shift employees had left, their co-worker Derek Lamont Simmons entered the room with a baseball bat in hand. He approached Foster as he sat at a table and struck him multiple times in the head. Williams got up and tried to intervene, but was hit in the back of the head with the same bat and collapsed. Simmons turned his attention back to Foster and continued striking him with a bat before switching to a hatchet and then stabbing him with a knife. The authorities were called and intercepted Simmons outside the facility as he was carrying 2 duffel bags. The man was in possession of several tools that weren't necessary for his job. Officers found Foster dead from blunt force trauma, while Williams was taken to a hospital with non-fatal injuries. Simmons was arrested on charges of first-degree murder and aggravated assault. Updates on the matter indicated that he was held at the Maricopa County Jail on a $1 million cash bond. The motive behind the man's workplace rampage remained unclear. Records indicated that the 50-year-old had a previous felony conviction for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Number 7. Clifford Curry. For about a year leading up to September of 2016, Army Lieutenant Katie Blanchard had worked alongside Clifford Curry in the Munson Army Health Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Curry, who was Blanchard's subordinate, had begun behaving in an aggressive and threatening manner towards her following a dispute in January of 2016. Blanchard reported him multiple times to her superiors, stated that she was afraid of him and asked to be accompanied by another staffer when working with him, but her requests were reportedly denied. On September the 7th, Curry walked into Blanchard's office with a plastic bottle containing gasoline. He doused the woman with the flammable liquid and set her on fire before attacking her with a straight-edge razor blade. He then grabbed a pair of scissors from the office to stab Blanchard and held her down by pressing his foot on her neck. A co-worker heard the woman's screams and walked in to find her on fire from the chest up. He pushed Curry away, and more military colleagues intervened to subdue him as the badly burnt Blanchard screamed at them, "I told you this would happen!" The woman, who was then 26 years old, suffered 3rd and 4th degree burns in addition to other injuries. She received treatment at an Army medical facility in San Antonio, Texas, and shared her progress with her family and friends on social media. Blanchard, who was left with scarring to her face and chest, later told a media outlet that she felt utterly let down by her superiors as they'd failed to address her concerns regarding Curry. The latter was convicted of assault with attempt to commit murder in August of 2017. He was given the maximum possible sentence of 20 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Number 6. Angel Footman. Florida teacher Angel Footman was arrested in the spring of 2023 for holding Fight Club-style brawls in her classroom at Griffin Middle School in Tallahassee. While sitting at her desk, 23-year-old Footman reportedly gave instructions that included no screaming, no phones, and the bouts lasting 30 seconds. The teacher's disturbing activities were uncovered by school administrators who were shown videos of the fights. In the footage, Footman made no efforts to intervene and stop them. It also emerged that students were asked back for more and even pulled out of classes to take part in the brawls. Law enforcement was called and they questioned Footman, who reportedly denied orchestrating the fights, but admitted failing to report, call for help, or intervene when they broke out. She was taken into custody and charged with 4 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Number 5. Ken Rosato. A veteran New York City news anchor was fired from his position in the spring of 2023 after a hot mic caught him insulting his co-host. Ken Rosato had started with ABC New York in 2003 as a freelance reporter for its Eyewitness News show. A few years later, he was promoted to the anchor desk, where he remained as a co-host for This Morning, alongside Shirlene Allacott, Heather O'Rourke, and Sam Champion. 56-year-old Rosato wasn't on air when he made a comment about Allacott, which was picked up on an open mic. There was initial speculation that the man had used a racial slur, but his agent adamantly denied the rumor, and it eventually emerged that Rosato had actually called Allacott the C word. He was promptly terminated from his position in the aftermath. Number 4. Daniel Conway. British Army Corporal Daniel Conway was jailed for more than 7 years in the summer of 2023 for assaulting a colleague in Catterick, North Yorkshire. The unnamed female soldier had arranged to stay in Conway's room after a party celebrating her promotion. He asked to join her and the woman agreed, but reportedly made it clear that nothing was going to happen. After a night out, the inebriated pair returned to the Harrogate barracks and fell asleep. The female soldier reportedly woke up to Conway performing an act on her and wasn't sure where to go or what to do, telling him to stop before going back to sleep. She later awoke to what she believed was Conway forcing himself upon her. The woman jumped out of bed and went to the bathroom. Upon returning to the room, she found that the corporal was gone. She subsequently confronted Conway on WhatsApp and wrote, "You need to be more aware of what is wanted and what is not." The man apologized and replied affirmatively when asked by the victim if he'd worn protection. However, when the woman claimed that he'd abused her, Conway denied that he'd gone all the way in the act. The woman reported him to the authorities, and upon being approached by officers, Conway told them, "I know why you're here. I didn't even sleep with her." DNA analysis found traces of his saliva on the female soldier's underwear, which, along with the message exchange, incriminated Conway. He was found guilty of abuse and assault by penetration at Bulford Military Court, Wiltshire, and sentenced to 7 years and 6 months in prison. Number 3. Bhaskar Rao. In 2020, during the coronavirus pandemic, Indian man Bhaskar Rao brutally beat a female co-worker for reminding him to wear a mask in the office. Rao, the deputy manager at the AP Tourism Hotel, charged Chakuri Usharan. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her from her chair to the floor at their office in Dagamita in the city of Nellore. In the CCTV recorded attack, Rao then reached for a sharp item on a desk and began stabbing the woman in the face with it. An elderly man intervened and tried to stop Rao, but was unable to do so and fell backwards on the floor with the victim's hair still in his grasp. Rao then armed himself with a wooden armrest that had broken off from Usharan's chair and forcefully struck the cowering woman several times in the head. Rao relented after other workers intervened and wrestled the wood rest out of his hand. He was arrested for assault and causing injuries using a weapon. Usharan suffered severe injuries as a result of Rao's onslaught, but wasn't reported as being in life-threatening condition. Number 2. Natalie Garcia. 24-year-old substitute teacher Natalie Garcia surrendered to police in Mesquite, Texas, in April of 2023 after she was charged with 4 counts of endangering a child. The teacher had been accused of organizing fights between her students at Kimbrough Middle School. She'd allowed and even encouraged 2 fights, one involving 2 boys and another between 2 girls. The daughter of a woman named Betty Martinez was in the classroom during the incidents, and she secretly recorded them. Garcia was heard saying that she didn't want the fights on record and went as far as to instruct a student to monitor the door while they unfolded. Martinez's daughter showed her the videos, and the woman later told a media outlet, "My brain couldn't comprehend what was going on." She reported Garcia, who was consequently arrested and fired while an investigation was underway. Number 1. Sean Runyon. In the fall of 2021, Sean Runyon was part of a group of electrical contractors working at the Publix Supermarkets construction site in Florida on behalf of J&B Electric, based in Pennsylvania. 39-year-old Runyon shared a rental house in Davenport, Central Florida, with several of his co-workers. At around 2 a.m. on October the 1st, Runyon got into an unspecified heated argument with his supervisor, 41-year-old Kevin Lanous. Runyon punched the man before leaving the construction site in the company truck after his half-brother, who owned the company, told him to return to Pennsylvania. Runyon parked the work vehicle at Tampa International Airport, rented a car, and then drove to a Target where he purchased a baseball bat. Runyon returned to the Davenport home where 7 people were staying at the time. He entered the residence armed with the bat and his personal knife. The man went into Lanous's room and, according to an affidavit, started hitting him in the head and didn't stop until he saw brain matter. As he moved through the home, Runyon entered several other rooms in which he beat a second co-worker to death and fatally stabbed a third. The victims were identified as Dulon Donnell and Gregory Dolzal, both in their 40s. Lanous survived long enough to be airlifted from the scene but later passed away in a hospital. Runyon had also targeted co-worker Albert Reed during the rampage, but only managed to non-fatally strike him in the shoulder and back as he fled. A few hours after the attack, Runyon turned up at her home in Lake Wells with his clothes covered in blood and told the homeowners that he'd been abused. The The people urged him to go to the hospital, where he was ultimately taken into custody. He reportedly confessed, and Polk County law enforcement subsequently told the media, "We have no idea what outraged him so badly that more than 24 hours later that he would come back and make an attempt to kill every one of them." At the time of the killings, Runyon was a fugitive from justice and had an active warrant in Pennsylvania for charges that included strangulation, simple assault, and drug possession. Updates on his case indicated that he would be extradited to Pennsylvania for the legal proceedings related to the aforementioned charges, while in Florida he faced the death penalty. Number 5. Luis Toledo. In October of 2013, Florida man Luis Toledo, a former gang leader, discovered text conversations between his wife, Yesenia Suarez, and her married co-worker, which indicated that they were involved in a romantic affair. Enraged by his discovery, Toledo ended up installing software on Suarez's phone to keep tabs on her text conversations. He even confronted her and her lover at their place of work on October the 22nd. The following day, Suarez's mother reported her and her 2 children missing from their home at 317 Covent Gardens Place in Deltona. It would later emerge that earlier that morning, Toledo had woken up his neighbor, Tyshawn Jackson, and enlisted his help in dumping his wife's car and other valuables at a Publix supermarket in Lake Erie. Jackson contacted the police about Toledo's strange request. When officers were dispatched to the Covent Gardens Place house to investigate, Toledo locked himself in a bathroom and shattered a mirror to cut himself. Law enforcement used a battering ram to break down the door, at which point the man was taken into custody. He later admitted to murdering his wife and her children in retaliation for her extramarital relationship. In October of 2017, Toledo was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, 2 in the first degree and 1 in the second. The following January, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Number 4. Gregory Allen Ringel. In the early hours of March the 29th of 2022, Michigan man Gregory Allen Ringel called the police to his home in the 4000 block of Palms Road in Casco Township. The 57-year-old reported that an armed intruder had broken into the house via the garage. Ringel's wife was awakened by a noise in the kitchen, but when she went to investigate, she was met by a shotgun blast. She shut the door, successfully keeping the assailant at bay. It was at that point that Ringel, who was purportedly asleep in another room, emerged with a handgun and shot in the intruder's direction. The individual escaped, and Ringel immediately dialed 911. As the police began investigating the incident, they began to detect inconsistencies in the man's testimony. When detectives learned that Ringel's wife had been in the midst of an affair with a co-worker at the time, they grew suspicious that perhaps the home invasion had been a complete fabrication. Ringel later admitted as much, telling investigators he'd actually been the one to shoot at his wife with the shotgun because he was incensed over her infidelity. He subsequently fired the handgun to legitimize his cover story. Ringel was arrested on charges of assault with intent to murder, firearm discharge in a building, false report of a felony, and 2 felony firearm violations. He was held at the St. Clair County Intervention and Detention Center on a $750,000 bond. Number 3. Brittany and Armando Barron. When New Hampshire man Armando Barron learned of his wife's infidelity, he devised a sinister plot to punish both her and her lover, a co-worker named Jonathan Amaro. In September of 2020, Armando beat his wife Brittany and strangled her until she passed out, leaving her with a pair of black eyes. He then used his wife's phone to lure 25-year-old Amaro to a park just north of the Massachusetts state line. Armando ambushed the victim, then led him into the back of his car at gunpoint. It was there that the jilted man allegedly forced his wife to slit Amaro's wrists before Armando fatally shot him 3 times, twice in the chest and once in the head. The couple subsequently drove roughly 200 miles north to a remote campsite where Armando forced Brittany to decapitate her dead lover with a saw so that he couldn't be identified. The woman complied with her husband's instructions, then wrapped Amaro's head in tarp and buried it in a grave. Fish and game officers came across Brittany alone at a campsite 2 days later. They subsequently found the aftermath of the gruesome killing and the Barons were taken into custody. Brittany ultimately pleaded guilty to 3 counts of falsifying evidence, for which she was given a prison term of 3.5 to 7 years. Her husband, meanwhile, was convicted of first-degree murder, among other charges, and was sentenced to life without parole plus 45 years. Number 2. Lee Rodart Jr. 21-year-old Savannah Page Gold was reported missing to the authorities on August 2nd of 2017. Her car and purse had been found in the parking lot of the Bonefish Grill on San Jose Boulevard in Jacksonville, Florida, where she worked as a waitress. Gold's family received text messages indicating she'd run away with a great guy she'd met, but never heard from her again, despite repeated attempts to contact her. Police reviewed surveillance footage from the Bonefish Grill on the night Gold disappeared, whereupon they discovered that she'd been in a physical altercation with the restaurant's manager, Lee Rodart Jr., inside his car. The vehicle was shown shaking as the door kept opening and closing until everything stopped. Rodart emerged, walked over to Gold's car, and took something from inside the driver's side door. He then punctured her front left tire, got back into his own vehicle, and drove away. At no point did Gold step out of Rodart's car following their struggle. The video of the altercation marked the final time the young woman had been seen alive. Detectives subsequently noted major discrepancies in Rodart's initial testimony, in which he'd reportedly claimed not to have seen Gold prior to her disappearance. The man was arrested in connection to an unrelated warrant for driving with a suspended driver's license. However, while he was in police custody, he allegedly incriminated himself in Gold's killing, as well as the disposal of her body. Rodart subsequently led police to the lake in the woods at the dead end of Club Duclay Drive, where Gold's remains were recovered. During the ensuing legal proceedings, Rodart claimed self-defense, asserting that Gold, his on-again, off-again girlfriend, had initiated the fatal confrontation in his car. His claims were rejected, however, and he ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for his tampering with evidence and abuse of a dead body charges getting dismissed. As part of the plea bargain, Rodart was sentenced to 40 years behind bars for the crime. Number 1. Ross McCullum. A workplace romance ended in tragedy for 23-year-old Megan Newborough, who was brutally murdered by her boyfriend during an encounter at his parents' Leicestershire home on August 6th of 2021. Newborough had reportedly worked as an HR representative at the place where Ross McCullum worked as a lab technician. The pair sparked up a relationship that lasted for a few weeks, but things abruptly turned sour on the night of the 6th. The young woman arrived at the residence shortly after 8 p.m., as was later detailed in court. Newborough was allegedly preparing to perform an intimate act on the man when he went into a blind rage. McCullum fatally strangled her before using a carving knife to slash her throat. He left the house at around 9 p.m., at which point he drove Newborough's body to a remote country road and threw it over a stone wall in Woodhouse Eaves. In the aftermath of the murder, McCullum went back home, where he reportedly watched explicit online videos, a habit he later admitted to practicing at least an hour each day. The man subsequently took painstaking steps to cover his tracks, including by sending voicemails and text messages to Newborough only hours after the killing, in which he professed his love for her and expressed concern for her well-being. During conversations with the police, McCullum was similarly deceitful, claiming his girlfriend had left home for a McDonald's milkshake and never returned. Eventually, however, he confessed to the murder and notified law enforcement of where he'd hidden the body. When Newborough's remains were examined, investigators found injuries from her shin to the crown of her head. Some of the marks seemed to suggest that a sustained, long, merciless struggle had unfolded in the moments before she succumbed to McCullum's attack. In court, the latter claimed that the victim had inadvertently triggered his latent PTSD stemming from childhood abuse, which had caused him to lash out in violence. He admitted manslaughter but was ultimately convicted of the more serious charge of murder, for which he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 23 years. Paramedics were dispatched to a home in Springfield, Illinois on December the 18th of 2022 after police requested medical assistance for a 911 caller who was suffering hallucinations due to alcohol withdrawal. After arriving on the scene, 44-year-old Peggy Finley entered the rear bedroom, where officers briefed her on the patient, Earl Moore. Despite the latter's condition, Finley immediately adopted an agitated tone, with him saying, "You're gonna have to walk, 'cause we ain't carrying you," before muttering, "I am seriously not in the mood for this." 2 officers helped Moore out of the house and onto a gurney. Finley and her colleague, 50-year-old Peter Cadigan, strapped the patient onto the stretcher in a prone position before loading him into the ambulance. Upon their arrival at the hospital, Moore was pronounced dead. The autopsy revealed that his death was caused by compressional and positional asphyxia due to prone face-down restraint on a stretcher by tightened straps across the back and lower body in the setting of lethargy and underlying chronic alcoholism. On January the 9th of 2023, Finley and Cadigan were arrested and charged with first-degree murder for their careless treatment of Moore, which ultimately proved deadly. As of the latest developments, the medics were being held at the Sangamon County Detention Facility on a $1 million bond each. Number 8. Manochica Daniels. In the early morning hours of December the 17th of 2019, the police in Lauderhill, Florida were called to the parking lot of a local gentleman's club where a toddler was seen wandering around in tears. Officers found the child, who led them to a vehicle that wasn't running and had the rear window cracked open for ventilation. Roughly 30 minutes later, 23-year-old Manochica Daniels exited Vegas Cabaret, where she worked as an exotic dancer, and identified herself to police as the abandoned child's mother. Daniels had reportedly left her 3-year-old daughter in the car at about 11 p.m. the previous night, at which point she went inside the club to begin her shift. For the careless parenting decision, which left her daughter alone and unattended for multiple hours, the young woman was arrested on a charge of child neglect. In the immediate aftermath of her arrest, her daughter was taken into protective custody. 2 years later, Daniels was arrested again after her child told the Florida Department of Children and Families that she'd been physically abused by her mother. According to the young girl's testimony, Daniels had struck her with a hairdryer cord several times because she was acting bad and not listening. Following her second arrest, Daniels faced a first-degree felony charge of child abuse with great bodily harm or torture, and a second-degree felony charge of child neglect. Number 7. Francisco Javier Lopez Martinez, a night shift cleaning lady at Dwight Morrow High School in Englewood, New Jersey, discovered a suspicious electronic device in the girl's bathroom and brought it to the police on January the 31st of 2019. The device was determined to be a hidden camera which had footage of the cleaner using the bathroom, as well as a clip of her boss, head custodian Francisco Javier Lopez Martinez, installing it. When the 59-year-old man learned that local authorities had been made aware of his actions, he fled from his Bergenfield home. The police later tracked him down to the high school campus where he was hiding, refusing to surrender. The school grounds were sealed off, and a law enforcement team that included a canine unit conducted a thorough search of the building. Lopez Martinez was finally located in the early hours of February the 1st. An officer wrestled away a handgun he had in his possession and placed him in handcuffs. The weapon was later determined to be an airsoft gun that resembled a large caliber firearm. Lopez Martinez was charged with third-degree invasion of privacy, burglary, possession of a weapon for unlawful use, illegal possession of a handgun on school grounds, hindering apprehension, obstruction of justice, and resisting arrest by flight. Number 6. Tashina Majors. A corrections officer at Northern State Prison in Newark, New Jersey was arrested in December of 2020 for having a year-long affair with a male inmate. According to the state's Attorney General's office, 42-year-old Tashina Majors had repeated intercourse with a prisoner over whom she had supervisory or disciplinary power, by virtue of her status as a senior correctional police officer. Law enforcement moved in on Majors following a joint investigation by the Attorney General's Office of Public Integrity and Accountability and Corrections Department's Special Investigations Division. She was charged with second-degree assault, which can carry a sentence of 5 to 10 years in state prison, as well as a fine of up to $150,000. As of the latest updates, the case's legal proceedings hadn't yet reached a conclusion. Number 5. Laura Campbell and Derek Miller. In 2017, Oklahoma authorities began investigating accusations that local postal workers were stealing drugs being sent through the mail. By September, investigators had identified 3 suspects, including postal employees Laura Campbell and Derek Miller, as well as the former's husband, David Waters. Subsequent reports revealed that Campbell was a supervisor at the mail processing plant in Tulsa, where Miller also worked. The police conducted surveillance of the co-conspirators, whom they observed separating certain packages from the rest of the mail. The targeted parcels, which Campbell and Miller suspected of containing various drugs, would be taken to the former's office, where they'd remove the substances and take them to their cars. A raid of Campbell and Waters' home near Teawa uncovered 13 pounds of marijuana, a half pound of cocaine, 304 ecstasy tablets, and 152 hydrocodone pills, along with meth and 5 guns. At Miller's house, officers seized 25 pounds of marijuana and cash. He was arrested for trafficking, while his co-worker and her husband were booked on 11 counts each. In the end, Miller admitted to swiping drugs from packages since 2015 and was given a suspended jail sentence plus probation. Campbell reached a plea deal with prosecutors and was ultimately sentenced to 5 months in prison. Number 4. Yandela Petolantino. On the evening of August the 11th of 2022, Ohio police were called to BJ's Restaurant and Brew House in Springdale for a report of an injured male on the premises. Upon arrival, officers found the victim, a restaurant employee named Paris Dismukes, in critical condition after reportedly being stabbed by a co-worker. Dismukes was rushed to the hospital, where he was ultimately pronounced dead. The police arrested another restaurant worker, 18-year-old Yandela Petolantino, at the scene. He was booked at the Hamilton County Justice Center and held without bond on charges of murder and drug possession. Court records indicated that 32-year-old Dismukes and Tolentino had been working a shift together that night when the latter suddenly attacked the victim, stabbing him multiple times in the neck. When asked to provide a reason for his violent outburst, Tolentino allegedly told investigators he'd targeted Dismukes because a witch told him that the other man was going to shoot him in the head with a gun. In October, Tolentino was declared incompetent to stand trial following a medical evaluation. He was ordered to undergo up to a year of treatment at Summit Behavioral Healthcare before his competence would be re-evaluated. Number 3. Madison Howard. In January of 2020, the Atascosa County Sheriff's Office in Texas released a statement detailing how corrections officers had discovered methamphetamine in a jail cell, prompting an investigation. Within a week, narcotics investigators had identified a suspect in the case, 19-year-old Madison Howard, who'd only been working as a correction officer for less than 2 months, had allegedly sold the illegal substance to an inmate at the jail. Surveillance footage showed Howard take the drugs directly to the unnamed inmate, who in turn gave her payment. The young woman was taken into custody, whereupon she was charged with possessing a prohibited substance in a correctional facility and possession of a controlled substance with intent to deliver. She was terminated from her position immediately following her arrest. Number 2. Patrick Ferguson. Tennessee man Robert Howard was reported missing by his girlfriend on January the 6th of 2021, having last been seen the previous day at his home in Memphis. The resulting investigation led to the discovery that 30-year-old Howard had been kidnapped and murdered by a Memphis police officer named Patrick Ferguson. According to an arrest affidavit, 29-year-old Ferguson had driven to the victim's home, abducted him at gunpoint, and after driving him about a third of a mile away, gunned him down in the back of his squad car. Investigators uncovered damning internet searches Ferguson had made in relation to cleaning up crime scenes and destroying DNA evidence. The police reviewed surveillance footage, which confirmed that the fatal shooting had occurred while the officer was on duty. Ferguson was relieved of duty and taken into custody on charges of first-degree murder in perpetration of aggravated kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with or fabricating evidence. A second suspect, identified as 28-year-old Joshua Rogers, was also arrested for allegedly helping Ferguson relocate the victim's body after the shooting. It later emerged that Howard's violent killing had been the culmination of a feud between him and Ferguson, stemming from his relationship with the officer's ex-girlfriend. Number 1. David Fuller. In 1987, a pair of young women were stalked, assaulted, and killed in separate attacks that occurred in Tunbridge Wells, an affluent town about 30 miles southeast of central London. The victims were identified as 25-year-old Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, aged 20. The killer remained unidentified for more than 3 decades. Then, in December of 2020, modern DNA technology allowed law enforcement to finally zero in on a suspect, David Fuller, who by that time was in his late 60s, subsequently had his East Sussex residence raided by the police. In the man's home, officers recovered hard drives full of footage in which he was shown abusing dead women's bodies in a mortuary. Fuller was reportedly employed as a hospital electrician, a position that granted him easy access to the morgue sections of 2 hospitals in Tunbridge Wells. Investigators determined that between 2008 and 2020, Fuller had systematically and repeatedly defiled upwards of 102 female corpses. Although there was no CCTV footage of the attacks, the man took his own videos and photographs of the heinous acts, which he would view after the fact. In 2022, Fuller pleaded guilty to the 1987 murders as well as the corpse abuse. Judge Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb told him he would spend the rest of his mortal life behind bars, as she handed down a whole life prison term as punishment for his various crimes. As Fuller was led out of the courtroom, there was a shout of "Scum!" from the public gallery. Family members of Fuller's victims were awarded compensation of up to £32,000 for psychiatric trauma and any financial losses caused by his actions. Number 11. Sarah Rivera and Debrecca L. Green. At a Hooters restaurant located in the Chicago suburb of Oak Lawn, police were called in to break up a fight between 2 workers on the afternoon of July the 20th of 2017. 25-year-old waitress Sarah Rivera got into an argument that escalated to violence with one of her co-workers, identified as 24-year-old Debrecca L. Green. Although the cause of the altercation wasn't made clear, the 2 young women were arrested at around 5 p.m., both charged with misdemeanor disorderly conduct, according to police records. They were later released on $120 bonds. Number 10. Viral McDonald's brawl. In late 2022, a massive brawl between 2 female McDonald's employees took social media by storm after a video of the violent incident emerged online. It was unclear where the physical altercation unraveled. The fight began when one of the workers threw a box of food in her co-worker's face. The 2 grabbed each other's hair and began landing punches as the situation devolved. At one point, one of the women was grabbed by the neck and slammed into the drive-through window. The altercation continued until other crew members finally stepped in to break them up. As the warring co-workers were separated, they continued to shout profanities at each other. A few moments later, the brawl resumed as one of the women pummeled the other in the head. Ultimately, the situation de-escalated after they were separated a second time. The video amassed over 10 million views online. There was very little additional information provided, as the location, cause, and potential legal ramifications of the violent altercation weren't immediately disclosed. Number 9. Brittany Randolph Johnson and Milan Etheridge. On the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, a Stone Mountain middle school teacher and a paraprofessional were charged with disorderly conduct following a fight on May the 19th of 2017. The incident, which was caught on video by students, was sparked when one of the female employees pushed a desk into the other in a classroom. Subsequently, the two women slapped each other in the head and pushed one another into the whiteboard. Some of the students started screaming, while others tried to break up the fight but then stepped back as the brawl spiraled. Another staff member eventually intervened and separated the two women. After footage of the incident circulated, the school released a statement saying that the teacher's conduct was completely unacceptable and contrary to the core principles of the Cobb County School District. The women involved, who were later identified as Brittany Randolph Johnson and Milan Etheridge, both aged 27, were consequently fired. Number 8. Chester McDonald's. An argument about who had to make apple pies at a McDonald's in Chester, South Carolina, resulted in a fist fight between two female crew members on May the 18th of 2016. The altercation unfolded at approximately 10 p.m. when a 30-year-old employee asked her 25-year-old co-worker to fry a new batch of pies. They squabbled with one another as the younger woman refused to make the pastries and hit her co-worker in the face, knocking her glasses off. A male customer told 13 News Now that he saw one of the women charging towards the other behind the counter while doing a flying punch. A glimpse of the dramatic moment, which was caught on video by patrons, showed the two women wrestling behind the counter. Eventually, other crew members stopped the fight, which law enforcement later labeled as a simple assault. However, it was unclear if either of the parties involved was charged. The video was uploaded on Facebook and accumulated over 90,000 views in less than 24 hours. Number 7. Delevious Tejon Gilbert. On March the 28th of 2023, a workplace dispute culminated in the fatal stabbing of 49-year-old Delevious Tejon Gilbert in Knightdale, North Carolina. At about 6:15 a.m. on the day in question, local officials received reports of a fight in progress at the Spectrum Drive business located off Hodge Road. Upon arrival, officers found Gilbert unconscious and suffering from multiple stab wounds. He was taken to Wake Med's trauma center where he later died. Officials said that the stabbing resulted from a prior argument between the victim and a male co-worker. Police detained a 43-year-old Raleigh man based on preliminary evidence. Meaningful developments came about after a video of the incident, which occurred in the business's break room, was recovered. The footage, which Knightdale Police Chief Lawrence Capps referred to as chilling, appeared to show Gilbert attacking his co-worker from behind, prompting the other man to fight back. Capps confirmed that it had been Gilbert who planned and launched the unprovoked attack. After the case was reviewed by the Wake County District Attorney's Office, the unnamed suspect was released from custody. Police said on March the 29th that the man, who also suffered deep head lacerations, wouldn't be charged. As of the latest updates, the case remained open with further investigation underway. Number 6. South Carolina Waffle House. A pair of South Carolina men working in a Hardeeville Waffle House brawled inside the establishment shortly before 6 a.m. on January the 19th of 2019. A video of the violent fight, which garnered 100,000 views on YouTube, started with the two employees already in the midst of a struggle, resulting in one of them bleeding from the arm. After another man defused the situation, the two were briefly separated, but continued in a heated verbal exchange. Subsequently, the staff member wearing a yellow shirt took two large knives and brandished them at his workmate in gray. The arguing continued and more fighting unfolded. A subsequent clip showed the eatery's windows shattered, which, according to the individual recording the video, was caused by the workers throwing things at each other. In the aftermath, the pair declined medical attention and no criminal charges were filed, according to the Hardeeville police chief. Number 5. Charlotte Burger King. Staff at a Burger King in Charlotte, North Carolina, were caught on video fighting with one another on May the 26th of 2019. As a woman by the name of Rebecca Ramsey pulled up to the restaurant's drive-thru, she heard a male employee in a red shirt scolding a male co-worker, telling him not to disrespect female customers. He was reportedly referring to a woman who'd complained about her order. A heated confrontation then ensued between the two male employees as they started grappling with each other, slamming against the drive-thru window several times. 3 additional employees then intervened and separated the warring parties. Ramsey later posted the video on Facebook where it went viral. Ultimately, Burger King's corporate office released a statement confirming that the two male employees involved had been fired, noting that their behavior, which didn't reflect their brand values, was unacceptable. Number 4. Rudy Gobert and Kyle Anderson. In the heat of an NBA playoff race on April the 9th of 2023, French basketball pro Rudy Gobert threw a punch at his teammate. During a timeout in the second quarter of a game against the New Orleans Pelicans, 30-year-old Gobert, a member of the Minnesota Timberwolves, got into a fiery dispute with Kyle Anderson, aged 29. On the bench, Anderson profanely urged Gobert to block more shots as the team was struggling. Subsequently, Gobert stepped closer and threw a punch to Anderson's chest. The latter then charged at Gobert, but another teammate immediately intervened and prevented the altercation from escalating further. Anderson was forcibly held back and ultimately walked away while Gobert was escorted to the locker room. As the second half of the game was underway, the Timberwolves announced that Gobert was to be held out for the rest of the game. The team's president of basketball operations later said that Gobert's behavior was unacceptable and that they'd handle the situation internally. The next day, Gobert was suspended for 1 game. Number 3. Ebony Angel Jordan and Bianca Alexandria Strayhorn. On the night of December the 1st of 2016, 23-year-old Ebony Angel Jordan and Bianca Alexandria Strayhorn, aged 26, were arrested after triggering a brawl at a bar in Milwaukee. The incident took place at Mettler's Bar and Restaurants, where the two exotic dancers got into an argument with 2 co-workers. The verbal sparring escalated to pushing and shoving, which caught the attention of staff. Jordan and Strayhorn were ordered to leave, but both women refused and instead proceeded to assault the other 2 dancers. Local law enforcement were called to the establishment shortly after 9 p.m. Jordan and Strayhorn were leaving the scene in a vehicle when a responding officer arrived. They were repeatedly ordered to stop the car but ignored the command and drove away. Eventually, the 2 women were stopped by another officer and taken into custody. According to a criminal complaint, Jordan had hit one of her co-workers near the eye with a stiletto and grabbed the other by the hair. The victim said that Strayhorn sprayed them with mace while Jordan was attacking them. The 2 suspects, both from Milwaukee, faced charges that included felony fleeing police, misdemeanor assault, disorderly conduct, and trespassing. Number 2. Morrow Walmart. 2 female Walmart employees got into a fight after they learned that their store manager, identified only as Wayne, had been sleeping with them both. Video footage, which was recorded at the store in Morrow, Georgia, showed a red-haired woman yelling and jumping demonstratively while being escorted away by another worker. The other woman, who had black hair, followed her and started to scream back. The black-haired woman subsequently used the store's intercom system to announce the manager's alleged affair. The video was uploaded on TikTok in October of 2022 and went viral with over 2.1 million views. Number 1. Anthony Field. On December the 9th of 2011, a Christmas party at an investment firm in East London's Queen of Hoxton bar descended into a violent brawl that stemmed from infidelity. According to the Daily Mail, 26-year-old Robert Nicholson found out about an affair that had been going on between his fiancée, 24-year-old Alex Miller, and his colleague, Anthony Field. The Brewin Dolphin stockbroker confronted Field about the matter. Nicholson grabbed him, and a fight broke out involving 6 other co-workers. In the aftermath, Field was left with 2 black eyes, as well as other facial injuries. Nicholson and 2 other employees, 26-year-old Graham Sutherland and Gary Jones, aged 32, were later arrested by police. Charges brought against the suspects included assault occasioning actual bodily harm and a fray. During the trial at Snaresbrook Crown Court in December of the following year, Field gave testimony in which he insisted that he hadn't known Miller was Nicholson's fiancée. Nicholson admitted a fray and was told by Judge Joanna Corner that he'd probably receive a community penalty. Judge Corner told the jury that the harm inflicted that night seemed to have been caused by the other people involved, not Nicholson. The latter and Sutherland were ultimately cleared of assault. Jones admitted smashing a glass bottle over Field's head during the fight, but it wasn't clear how he was punished by the court. Number 7. Marta Vento. 27-year-old Marta Vento was working the night shifts behind the front desk at a travel lodge in Dorset, England, on December the 9th of 2020. The young woman, originally from Valencia, Spain, was taken entirely by surprise when a male guest launched a sudden and vicious attack on her in the foyer of the Bournemouth Hotel, later identified as 32-year-old Stephen Cole. The man chased Vento into an alcove where he repeatedly punched and kicked her until she became unresponsive. She ultimately died from multiple blunt force head injuries. Vento was the only employee behind the desk for the night shift and consequently wasn't found until horrified guests came across her bloodied corpse the next morning. In the incident's aftermath, it was revealed that Cole was a diagnosed schizophrenic who'd stopped taking his prescribed medication. As a result, he'd been experiencing persecutory delusions, auditory hallucinations, and disorganized thinking, which included the belief that smoke detectors were surveying him. Following a mental health evaluation, it was determined that Cole's attack had been triggered by the way in which Vento had smiled at him from behind the reception desk. He was reportedly staying at the travel lodge on his parents' dime after being kicked out of another hotel for attacking 2 guests just days earlier. Though initially detained for murder, Cole eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. In the summer of 2021, Judge Angela Morris of the Winchester Crown Court gave Cole an indefinite hospital order in lieu of jail time. Number 6. Asante Campbell. Before leaving home to work the graveyard shift on the night of February the 29th of 2019, North London man Asante Campbell said goodnight to his fiancée and their infant daughter. After departing from his Hendon home, 24-year-old Campbell, a rail worker, was accosted by a group of men who stabbed him through the window of his car. The injuries he sustained in the ambush attack ultimately proved fatal. Police found DNA on the knife sheath used in the stabbing, which was linked to a drill rapper by the name of Javel Hall, aged 18. He was reportedly able to evade capture for several months after the incident by hiding out in Leeds and Manchester, but was eventually tracked down and arrested. During the resulting trial at the Old Bailey, Hall attempted to pass off his own fingerprints as those of his identical twin brother, but his claims of innocence were rejected. Although the motive for the deadly assault wasn't immediately made clear, he was found guilty of murder, along with an accomplice named Kofi Abusa. They both received life sentences with minimum terms of 19 years. In court, Campbell's mother Angela made a victim impact statement in which she recounted her late son's charitable nature and infectious presence. She revealed how Campbell had previously stepped in to play football with a boy who was alone at the park, supported the family of a girl with thoughts of self-harm, and on one occasion, even drove a complete stranger to the airport. Number 5. Esvin Vasquez. On November the 13th of 2022, a violent altercation at a gas station in Queens, New York, left 23-year-old Esvin Vasquez dead. The young man, who worked with his brother at a furniture store to provide for his wife and 1-year-old son, had reportedly stopped at a BP station after completing a late-night shift. However, as he was filling up his tank, Vasquez got caught up between 2 large groups of strangers who were in an argument that eventually boiled over into physical violence. During the course of the brawl, Vasquez was struck over the head with a wooden board and suffered severe injuries that ultimately claimed his life. Although the cause of the fight wasn't known to the police during their initial investigation, eyewitnesses claimed that there were roughly 10 to 12 people involved and that it happened at around 2 a.m. MD Shaika, who was working at the gas station, reported the incident to the authorities after witnessing one of the men grab the wooden board used against Vasquez from a nearby construction site. In the wake of the young man's death, his loved ones honored him with a makeshift memorial near the gas station, outfitted with flowers and candles. Police records indicated that Vasquez, who'd been living in New York for a year and a half after emigrating from Guatemala in search of a better life for his young family, didn't have a criminal record. About a week after the incident, the Regional Fugitive Task Force took 20-year-old Michael Santander into custody in connection with Vasquez's killing. He faced charges of murder, manslaughter, gang assault, and criminal possession of a weapon. Number 4. Andy Ferguson. A 22-year-old intern from Canada was killed in a head-on collision with a gravel truck early one morning in November of 2011. Although the highway was clear and weather conditions were favorable, Andy Ferguson fell asleep at the wheel, causing his vehicle to cross the center line and end up directly in the truck's path. In the wake of the young man's death, his family came out and publicly blamed the accident on his extreme fatigue. He'd reportedly worked 16 hours over a 24-hour period, starting the previous morning and ending with the graveyard shift that night. Ferguson was studying radio and television production at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology in Edmonton. One of the requirements for him to graduate from the program was completing a 4-month unpaid practicum for Astral Media's local pop rock radio stations. In addition to the hours he put in for the practicum, he was also working shifts as a paid intern. Ferguson had complained to a friend about the exorbitant hours he was being asked to work as recently as during his final overnight shift at the station prior to his death. The Ferguson family subsequently sought to have legislation implemented to protect unpaid interns from exploitation. Number 3. Queensland Postal Service incident. In March of 2017, multiple articles surfaced online detailing how Australia Post employees were forced to work around the dead body of their co-worker for several hours during an overnight shift. 3 postal employees informed the press about the incident, which began after a 49-year-old contractor went into cardiac arrest and died in the Nambour Australia Post building during the early morning hours of March the 9th. Police were called to the scene, but employees at the Queensland facility were allegedly pressured to continue working, despite the man's body still lying on the floor as they awaited the arrival of an undertaker. A blanket was placed over the man and several witches' hats were positioned around his body, but workers otherwise went about their normal routine for the remainder of the graveyard shift. When news of the incident hit the internet, many empathized with the distressed postal employees, one of whom said that Australia Post should be held to account on why dollars were more important than people's well-being and the deceased's dignity. In response, a spokesperson for the mail company stated that while the facility in question had remained operational as the authorities sorted things out, none of the staff members were forced to work. The Community Workers Union of Queensland publicly offered support to those who were left traumatized by the tragic situation. Number 2. Kerry Brown. Irish nurse Kerry Brown got into a car accident while driving home from the graveyard shift at Kerry University Hospital on the morning of October the 2nd of 2019. The 26-year-old, who was a finalist at the London Rose of Tralee beauty pageant in 2016, reportedly crashed into an SUV on the N21 in County Kerry. The young woman's vehicle was lifted into the air while the SUV was sent back about 10 feet by the force of the impact. Emergency crews consisting of some of Brown's colleagues rushed to the crash site, but were unable to save her. She was pronounced dead at the scene in spite of extensive life-saving efforts on the part of first responders. Meanwhile, the other motorist, later identified as John Power, needed to be hospitalized for the injuries he sustained. Through an official inquest into the matter, it emerged that Brown had veered into the path of the oncoming SUV in the moments leading up to the collision. Power, a self-employed engineer, reportedly took evasive action by reducing his speed considerably and even driving into a barrier to avoid Brown's Volkswagen Golf, to no avail. The coroner found no evidence that drugs or alcohol had played a role in the tragedy. Rather, it was Brown's extreme tiredness brought on by working a 12-hour overnight shift at the hospital that was identified as the accident's primary cause. Number 1. Britrain Marcellus Gray. At approximately 4:45 a.m. on May the 13th of 2022, gunfire broke out in a McDonald's located at 1130 Crane Highway South in Gambrills, Maryland. Responding police officers came upon a deceased man who'd sustained apparent gunshot wounds, later identified as 23-year-old Odenton resident Britrain Marcellus Gray. The victim had reportedly been working the graveyard shift at the fast food eatery's drive-through window when he was shot to death by a customer. A couple months later, homicide detectives announced that they'd identified a suspect in the case. 21-year-old Jaquan Green from Middle River was the individual determined to have been responsible for the deadly shooting, which investigators believed to be a targeted attack rather than a random act of violence. Green was taken into custody on a charge of first-degree murder. However, according to police records, he was also charged in connection with an unrelated triple shooting that occurred in Prince George's County on June the 13th. which resulted in one death. As of the latest updates on the case, investigators were still working to ascertain the circumstances that led to Green's fatal confrontation with Gray. Number 6. Roy Den Hollander. American lawyer Roy Den Hollander was a self-admitted anti-feminist and a men's rights activist who'd filed a string of lawsuits against ladies' night promotions at various nightclubs and bars. He also sued Columbia University for incorporating women's studies classes. His lawsuits were largely unsuccessful and openly mocked by those he sought to oppose. In 2015, he represented plaintiffs challenging the constitutionality of the male-only draft in the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey. Judge Esther Salas allowed the case to proceed to court but was against some of Hollander's arguments. He later came to believe that she was purposefully stalling out of political motivation. Hollander had also been part of the National Coalition for Men, or the NCFM, before he was kicked out following a disagreement with fellow members, including lawyer Mark Angelucci. Hollander was said to have perceived Angelucci as a rival and held a grudge against him. Evidence suggests that following a terminal cancer diagnosis in 2019, Hollander launched a campaign to eliminate his perceived enemies. On July the 11th of 2020, Angelucci went to the front door of his home in Cedar Pines Park, California, after being told that a package had arrived for him. A man dressed as a delivery worker then executed him at point-blank range. Angelucci was pronounced dead at the scene. 8 days later, Judge Esther Salas was in the basement of her home in New Jersey when a gunman arrived at her residence. Her 20-year-old son, David, was shot dead. Salas's husband, Mark, also suffered multiple gunshot wounds and was left in critical condition, but survived. A man in a FedEx uniform was spotted in the neighborhood at the time of the attack, but he couldn't be confirmed as the shooter. 72-year-old Hollander's lifeless body was found the following day in upstate New York, and it was determined he died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. A car rented in his name was discovered on the same road as his body, and it contained a list of targets that included Salas, Angelucci, and an oncologist who'd treated him. The Walther semi-automatic handgun he'd used matched the caliber of the weapons used on Angelucci and Salas's family. Hollander was identified as the primary subject in both shootings. Number 5. Todd Macaluso. From 2009 to 2010, Todd Macaluso represented Casey Anthony in what Time magazine dubbed the social media case of the century. Anthony faced the death penalty after being charged with the murder of her own child, which prosecutors argued she'd done to free herself from parental responsibility. In 2011, Casey was found not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter of a child, which triggered public outrage. Following her acquittal, Macaluso reportedly used his private jet to fly her out of Orlando. In November of 2015, Macaluso was given heavy fines and sentenced to 5 months in jail after pleading guilty to wire fraud in California. Without his clients' knowledge, he'd put up their personal injury cases as collateral, forging their signatures to enter funding agreements with investors. He was disbarred in 2016. While out on supervised release, that same year, Macaluso was involved in another high-profile case, only not as a legal representative, but as a suspected drug smuggler. He was charged with taking part in an international trafficking conspiracy that involved transporting roughly 3,000 pounds of cocaine aboard his Falcon 10 private jet. According to the prosecution, he'd repeatedly met with drug distributors in Tijuana, Mexico. In November of 2016, he flew to Haiti and was expected to transport the drugs the day after his arrival. The plan was to take them to Honduras, from where they'd be sold to Mexican dealers and imported in the US. Once the drop-off was complete, Macaluso was supposed to receive $200,000, according to federal agents. The plot was uncovered after his name came up while investigators were looking at drug traffickers planning to use planes registered in the US. Macaluso never made it out of Haiti, as he was arrested alongside 2 accomplices. The former lawyer was extradited to the US, where he was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison, in addition to a $10,000 fine. Number 4. Thomas Lowe. In August of 2011, lawyer Thomas Lowe, a man in his late 50s met a client whose identity wasn't released to discuss the possibility of representing her in a divorce. Lowe, who worked out of an office in Burnsville, Minnesota, then preyed on the woman's vulnerability. During a phone call with her several days later, he complimented her on her appearance, asked intimate questions about her marriage life, and asked if she was interested in him. They went on to have an affair while Lowe acted as her attorney. Perhaps most shocking of all, Lowe billed the woman on the dates they met to have intercourse. They were registered as meetings or drafting memos, reportedly amounting to nearly $1,000. In what was reported as an attempt to save his own marriage, Lowe broke it off with the client and 2 days later also withdrew as a lawyer. Lowe initially denied it, but eventually unconditionally admitted to the transgression. On January the 10th of 2013, the Supreme Court of Minnesota ruled that he be suspended indefinitely. Number 3. Michael Avenatti. In one of the more high-profile cases of his career, lawyer Michael Avenatti represented adult film actress Stephanie Clifford, professionally known as Stormy Daniels, in the scandal with former US President Donald Trump. Daniels had attempted to go public on an affair she'd allegedly had with Trump in 2006. In the final days of the 2016 presidential election, she was paid $130,000 by Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Avenatti then represented Daniels in March of 2018 in a lawsuit seeking to invalidate the NDA. He also represented her in a defamation lawsuit against Trump, which was ultimately dismissed. Later, Daniels would claim that the lawyer had filed the suit against her wishes, and he was also accused of embezzling $300,000 from her. Avenatti capitalized on the attention from the case and went on what was described as a publicity tour, making over 100 TV appearances and commenting on the case on social media. In March of 2019, Daniels terminated her arrangement with him. That same month, he was arrested in New York City for trying to extort $25 million out of shoe and athletic apparel company Nike. On the 25th, he was taken into custody 15 minutes after announcing that he'd hold a press conference the following day to reveal a scandal involving the company that related to high school and college basketball players. On the 25th in the afternoon, Avenatti and an unnamed accomplice were meant to meet lawyers from Nike after reportedly offering to cancel the conference in exchange for payment. He was ultimately found guilty on 3 counts of attempted extortion and in July of 2021 sentenced to 30 months in prison. Number 2. Clement Vallandigham. In the 1800s, at the time of the American Civil War, Clement Vallandigham was the leader of the Copperheads, a faction of the Democrats that wanted immediate peace with the Confederates. 15 Democratic congressmen adhered to a slogan that Vallandigham had coined, in which stated the aspiration to maintain the Constitution as it is and to restore the Union as it was. He was a prominent critic of President Abraham Lincoln and a chief officer in a secret anti-war society called the Knights of the Golden Circle, which later became the Sons of Liberty. For all the political controversy surrounding him, Vallandigham's life ended rather unceremoniously in 1871 when he accidentally shot himself in the abdomen while trying to prove a client's innocence. At a trial in Lebanon, Ohio, he represented a man accused of shooting another during a ballroom brawl. Vallandigham argued that the victim had accidentally shot himself as he rose from a kneeling position and drew the pistol from his pocket. 50-year-old Vallandigham selected a pistol he believed to be unloaded and, in court, enacted the events as they might have happened. During the demonstration, he snagged the weapon, which was in fact loaded, on his clothing, and it discharged into his stomach. The ball of the pistol is believed to have gotten trapped near his bladder, but doctors were unable to find it, and he succumbed to peritonitis the following day. Albeit tragic, Vallandigham's demonstration irrefutably proved his point, and his client was acquitted, only to eventually be gunned down in a saloon 4 years later. Number 1. Richard Merritt. In January of 2019, disgraced and disbarred lawyer Richard Merritt was sentenced to 15 years in prison and another 15 on probation for stealing from over a dozen of his clients in Cobb County, Georgia. 44-year-old Merritt was found guilty on 34 counts of theft and exploitation. He admitted to settling civil lawsuits behind his clients' backs, forging their signatures on official documents, and then keeping the money intended for them. Roughly 17 of his clients were affected by Merritt's actions that resulted in him stealing over $450,000, which he reportedly used to buy a Porsche and pay for lavish holidays. After his sentencing, Merritt was given 2 weeks to get his affairs in order, after which he was meant to turn himself in on February the 1st. Merritt didn't surrender to face justice for his crimes and instead cut off his ankle monitor and went on the run. U.S. Marshals headed to a Stone Mountain home in DeKalb County on February the 2nd to retrieve him. They arrived to find that his mother, 77-year-old Shirley, had been brutally murdered. She'd been bludgeoned and stabbed to death, with Merritt subsequently becoming the main suspect in her killing. He was also reported to have stolen his mother's Lexus SUV as he fled from the law. A nationwide manhunt was launched, with U.S. Marshals warning the public not to engage Merritt as he was to be considered armed and dangerous. There were concerns that he'd seek revenge on his former clients who'd pressed charges against him. After around 8 months, he was found near a thrift shop in Tennessee and arrested without incident. A DeKalb County grand jury indicted him for the murder and assault of his mother. According to updates on the case, he was still awaiting a trial date. Number 6. Megan Hall. A workplace misconduct scandal decimated the Laverne Police Department in Tennessee after an internal investigation was launched in December of 2022. According to a 20-page investigative report on the matter, Officer Megan Hall was accused of having repeated intimate relations with several of her colleagues, including a sergeant. The employees named in the report were Sergeant Lewis Powell, Officer Patrick Maliocco, Officer Larry Holliday, Detective Seneca Shields, and Officer Juan Lugo Perez, all of whom admitted to having relationships with Hall. Some of the officers involved in the scandal reportedly had previous policy violations on their records, including for speeding and smoking in patrol vehicles, using department computers for personal matters, and even an unrelated misconduct investigation. Hall, who joined the force back in 2020, had been reprimanded numerous times prior to the latest scandal, and on multiple occasions had gotten into trouble for crashing her patrol car. The internal investigation uncovered that the accused officers had had intimate encounters while on duty and on city property. The report also detailed a raunchy hot tub party, as well as the alleged exchange of explicit photographs between the officers involved. Hall, who was married at the time, was terminated from her position in the wake of the report's publication. 4 additional officers were fired while 3 others were suspended. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be arrested in front of your boss or in front of your mother? Let us know in the comments section below.